Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a very special episode of the EDHRECast. I'm Matt Morgan, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, well, one of my partners in crime, but it's Dana Roach. Dana, how's it going, bud?
It is going pretty good. How about yourself?
We're hanging in there. We're doing everything here. Have a nice episode for you this week. Dana, what is the topic this week?
We're going to be, it's been a while since we've actually kind of done an interview with each other and talked to each other about our own brewing habits. So this is going to be Brewing with Matt, the primer on turning creatures sideways.
I mean, primer is a good way to put it. I not to brag, somewhat of an aficionado when it comes to turning creatures sideways, combat steps. I'm excited. I don't know about you, but little change of events here. But yeah, you're right. It was fun to kind of talk to each other, grill each other about our thought process when we brew decks. So it'll be a nice kind of return to that. And so, let's get into that. But real quick, before we do, have a few shout outs to do first.
Yeah, first we'd like to thank Ultimate Guard. We are now proud members of Team Ultimate Guard. Their products are pretty easy to recommend because we actually use them. If you see us anywhere this fall, MagicCon Las Vegas in October, you'll see our decks sleeved up with katana sleeves. They'll be safe inside Boulder deck boxes. And I think if you're at those events, you're going to see Matt and I and Joey carrying around our deck boxes in the new Ultimate Guard Vago backpack.
I do love the backpack. And actually, I want to shout out too, if you haven't had a chance to check out the Return to Earth boulders yet, they're made out of recycled materials, and just, it's nice to have a company that puts effort into sustainability, and seeing Ultimate Guard do that. The deck boxes hold up great. I'm a big fan of them too. Can't shout them out enough. And if you'd like to support the show, you can do so by liking, subscribing to this video on YouTube, subscribing to the local podcast app, leaving us a review over there. We appreciate all that support over there. It's a nice free way to support us. But if you are so moved, you can go to patreon.com/EDHRECast. All sorts of different tiers there, whether you want to join our Discord community, you want to see all of the episodes a day early. You could be watching this and your friends won't even know what you're talking about when you tell them how good this episode was because they didn't go to patreon.com/EDHRECast, which is something that our weekly patron shoutouts did. So Joshua Glab, we are very glad that you went to Patreon to support us that way. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Joshua Glab, you were also fantastic as Olaf in the Frozen movies. I'm a big fan, so thank you very much for all your good work in cartoon musicals, and thank you for supporting us.
Yeah, that's totally the same Joshua. I very much agree.
Absolutely.
But, well, awesome. Well, with that said, out of the way, Dana, you said we're going to talk about some strategies that I like to do, so I'm going to turn it over to you on this one.
Yeah, for sure. Like Mr. Selesnya, Matt Morgan. So let's talk a little bit about turning stuff sideways and brewing commander decks to do that.
Deal.
But first here, actually, I want to ask you, how did you get into Magic initially? What did you first start playing?
So the fun story, I first got into Magic, actually, my first booster pack that I opened was Homelands. And everybody loves to rag on Homelands because it was such a terrible set historically. You're right. It was terrible. I found old cards from when I was a kid. Definitely not a good set, but I loved it for some reason. I can't justify it. Don't ask me to. But I did play a lot. So I got to print a bunch of pre-releases, played just very much the casual Magic of the day, which was, this is a pile of cards that I have. And I played with my cousins, my family growing up, and then I got to high school, got really busy, did a lot of sports and activities in high school, so I didn't really have time for Magic. But I got back into it around Theros time, and I just haven't looked back ever since. So it's been super fun, but I've always had a penchant for turning things sideways and playing big green creatures.
So you do have a bit of a background playing competitive formats. You're never a Pro Tour level grinder, but you did a lot of that before you played Commander, right?
I did, yeah. So I never made it to the Pro Tour. I made it to a bunch of PTQs. I got qualified for several Star City Invitationals back when those were a thing too. I just never had a chance to actually travel for that because I was a little bit far for everything in my situation at the time. But yeah, I have pro points. I've day two'd several GPs. So it's actually kind of funny looking back at there's a Magic ELO project right now that people are kind of trying to seed all these professional players. And I'm like, oh, there's me getting beat by some of the greats of the day. So it was kind of fun to see that. But yeah, I played a lot of Legacy, played a lot of Modern. Still similar strategies though. I played Infex, I played the kind of the collected company deck in Modern for a long time. So still was turning things sideways even when it wasn't in Commander.
Yeah, that was kind of where I was going with that, was like, I was wondering, so when you were playing those formats, you were still kind of playing creature combat-based decks.
Oh yeah, 100%. Same thing. I mean, even when I played a lot of Merfolk in Modern. I know that the prof over at Tolarian Community College will give an endorsement to that deck, but it was a lot of fun. Like, probably the most fun during the Eldrazi winter, because I just got to cast Spreading Seas on all of their Eldrazi lands and then just go on Block Will from there anyways. So it was a lot of fun. Yeah, just I was always doing kind of the same thing I do in Commander now. Same strategies, same typical, win conditions almost, but just a little bit bigger now.
So when did you first become aware of EDH as a thing? Like what caught your attention? What brought you into trying that versus like playing 60 card comp formats?
Yeah, so my play group at the time, when I was living with people who got me back into the game, they very much were like, hey, I want to try this Commander thing. It seems kind of fun. I was very skeptical, actually. Like I was one of the early, this isn't a real format, this isn't actually doing anything. But eventually we did. We all built our first decks, and it was actually a lot of fun. It was fun getting to have that, 4-player setting, the multiplayer aspect, where it wasn't just you versus me and I'm going to kind of take you down. That mentality was fine, because I'm a very, very competitive person. I played sports in college, so it was fun to have that competitive outlet. But then having a chance to still play the same game, but an entirely different experience, was such a shift. And I absolutely loved it. It was a nice way to have everybody at the table, all involved, all at the same time. And it took a little bit of a mentality shift, but it still was super, super, to me at least, worth that change of mentality too, and accepting that, again, it's the same game, but it is a very, very different experience.
So when you started brewing decks or putting them together, then did that like, I'm going to swing creatures at people mindset also come over from playing 60 card formats? Was that your first like instinct was to do that, I'm assuming?
Yes, 100%. My first Commander deck was Mael the Anima, which shout out to Naya Big Dumb Creatures.
Right.
I've had a type pretty much my whole life.
Perfect version of Big Dumb Creatures is that deck.
Like, and you kind of did the same thing. Like when we talk about how you used to play Modern, you play Boggles.
Yeah.
You don't have to pay attention to the format. You don't have to pay attention to the other decks that are being played. You can just plop down and do the thing. You kind of have the same approach too when it comes to like your Khalifi deck. You sit down,
sure. You're
going to not really worry about whatever because you're playing enough protection. You're just going to sit down, suit up a creature, and then swing out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. A lot of that, those tendencies we have when we play any format tend to kind of bleed over from one to the next. I would wager.
Oh yeah.
At least that's been my experience.
Yep. So that very much applied to me, and so over the course of me playing Commander, that's actually how I got into making content. I got to write articles for EDHREC way back in the day, and that was a lot of fun because I was one of the only people on staff that played 60 card formats but also played Commander. And so my article series was taking these 60 card constructed decks, turning them into fun Commander decks. And it was a lot of fun. Like, it's how I got my start making content, which eventually led to the three of us doing this podcast.
Well, so when we first started doing this show, we had a piece of art for a playmat commissioned by an artist I think who was a friend of yours. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that really caught my eye in that piece of art was, and hopefully we can put it up here on the YouTube channel so people can see it, was you looked like an adult version of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes in that art. And that to me perfectly kind of represented how I think about you in Commander. Like Calvin with like two toys kind of smashing them together. And like, that's very much how I picture you. I've never been able to shake that image in my mind. And I think it captures you and how you play Magic perfectly.
I hope that's a compliment, but you are
absolutely
right. Like the Calvin, just like, here's two big spaceships in my hypothetical. Like,
yep.
I have this grand view of what's going on, and then all of a sudden it goes to paper and it's like, it's actually not that big. It's still cool, but it's not this
right.
grand thing that I had cooked up in the back of my brain.
So going over your decks on Architect here, green is unsurprisingly kind of the predominant color in those decks, and there's a lot of white, a lot of red that are doing green things in those decks as well, and even the decks that aren't running green are doing green things, like making tokens, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So it's clearly something that appeals to you as a color. Why is that? What is it about that makes it fun for you?
I think just playing in my comfort zone. I will build decks every now and then that are outside my comfort zone, outside of what I normally like to do. But there's nothing wrong with having something that you like to do. I think people,
Sure.
We talk to our patrons in our Discord every now and then, and they're kind of like, just have fun with it. Just embrace it. There's no reason to shy away from things that you like to do. And yeah, take calculated risks with your deck building. I hope people don't take my proclivity for this is what I like to do, and I'm kind of sticking with it, to say you shouldn't push limits. You shouldn't, expand your horizons a little bit, because that's absolutely not what I'm saying at all. It's just, I know what I like to do. I've been doing this for a while, and so this is what is kind of where I always tend to gravitate to. Even when I'm not trying to do something, it always ends up looking the same.
So one thing I've kind of observed over the years in friends of mine, I have a couple friends that are kind of combo-y players, or they're really into like some kind of a fiddly thing where you're not really paying attention to what they're doing. They're like, okay, I'm going to sacrifice this thing to the graveyard, and then I'm going to loop this thing to bring it back and do this and do that. And like,
sure,
with a plan, but like their decks tend to do that. And my friends that build decks that way tend to be kind of introverted people.
Sure.
And my friends that tend to build really heavy creature combat decks, well, at least observationally, are friends that are kind of extroverted. And I have this theory that like the thing about combat damage that people like is it involves everyone at the table.
Okay.
I'm swinging at you. I'm swinging at you. You have to make decisions. Everyone has to decide during that combat damage step how they want to interact. You are forcing everyone to kind of play along with you versus you are just kind of doing parallel play by yourself.
Whereas the introverts are over there just like, leave me alone. I don't want to talk to you.
I don't mean that in a bad way. Just it's something, and like you are very much someone who like strikes me as, I want everyone to be involved. I want us to all come together and do this thing. And I think combat damage decks are a way to like kind of make everyone play together and be social.
It's the solitaire versus the twister. Like everybody's going to get in this big pile, and everybody's reaching for something. But now that you kind of say that, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm kind of seeing it play out in my own deck building, because you're right. I am fairly extroverted. I've gotten more introverted as I've gotten older and grumpier, I guess. But I also think you are right. Like that's one reason. So I have a Vivictus Asmati, the Dire deck, and that deck is all about kind of controlled chaos, where it's targeting something for everybody, and we're all flipping. I like that deck because everybody, even when it's my turn, everybody's paying attention. Everybody is involved. And that's the reason I played Commander to begin with. It was the social aspect of it. It was, I want to do these things with my friends and kind of have these experiences. And so for me, you're right. I do play a lot of combat decks. I play a lot of decks. Joey likes to say my onboard tricks, whether it's a Scavenging Ooze, something like that, that's on the battlefield. You can see it and everybody's able to kind of evaluate it.
Sure.
Me putting stuff on the battlefield, everybody has to pay attention. Everybody is kind of having that shared experience where like, I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm not trying to do my own thing. I want you all to know, like, this is what I'm doing. Do you want to participate or not? And whether they participate is, are they blocking? Are they trying to do something about it? Or are they just letting me run them over? Either way, like they're still kind of involved in what I'm trying to do as well. So I like how you put that though, where it's introverts versus extroverts, and just anecdotally playing out, like you are right. Like a lot of my friends in my play group, the introverts play kind of they're more like, I'm going to solitaire a little bit more than you are. And the extroverts are, here's a big dumb thing. What do you think?
Right. Right. We're all doing, I love Twister as an analogy. Like we're all doing this thing together. We're all getting in the big pile.
Yeah, it's not sorry because I'm not sorry.
Right.
Maybe the game of life because hard lessons are about to get taught.
Sure.
Maybe, but Twister, yeah, where it's just, okay, my hand's in, where's yours at?
So to go into brewing here a little bit, I'm guessing that you kind of come at this from the top down, where like you see a commander and you're like, that looks cool, and I want to build a deck around that, and it's kind of pointing me in a general direction. So I like the things it's asking me to do, and I want to do that. Is that say an accurate assessment? I
think that's a pretty accurate assessment. It typically will start with the commander for me. I like to say on the show a lot that I'll start with an interaction. I'll start with some kind of synergy that I see played out between a couple cards, and I'll try to build around that. The most recent deck that I built from the ground up, it wasn't like a pre-con that got modified over time, was my Raga Draga Gorguts boss deck. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, okay, this is super cool because I like playing a bunch of mana dorks. I like playing my Llanowar elves, my Birds of Paradise. But then, after the game progresses a little bit, you kind of look at the deck and like, okay, well, what if I draw another one? That doesn't help me on turn 7. I don't need another mana dork. And Raga Draga solved my problem with playing those types of decks of, well, they're useless later on. Well, with Raga Draga giving all my creatures with mana abilities a nice little buff, that downside kind of went away. And so as I started workshopping through that Raga Draga deck and what do I want to do? What do I want this to look like? I realized, Eldrazi Scions and Spawns, they have mana abilities. And yes, they're very small. They're not great on their own, but it's really easy to make a lot of them. Making a lot of them and then buffing them up, that was such a fun kind of light bulb moment for me where, oh my gosh, like this interaction that I wanted to build around just keeps getting better and better.
And I will note this too regarding your Raga Draga deck. I actually was playing at a LGS that's not near me. I sometimes, when I'm traveling for work or whatever, stop in a game store and play some games. Mm-hmm. I was playing in a pod where a guy was playing Raga Draga with Scions and Spawns. Mm-hmm. I was like, oh, Raga Draga, that's cool. And I just, in general, and he's like, yeah, one of the guys on EDHRECast gave me the idea. He's got the same deck. Yes. And I didn't say anything. Because he clearly it didn't register that I was on the EDHRECast, and there's zero cool way to be like, do you know who I am? So I just didn't. I was like, no, that's good.
But like that, just on that point though, I love playing anonymously. Like I recently moved to another side of town, and so I've been exploring local game stores, trying to find where's a situation where I can kind of drop in and just play. And I don't tell people who I am. It makes me kind of feel uncomfortable on that sense. So getting to play anonymously is super fun. And my fiance is like, are you going to tell them who you are? Are you going to wear the shirt? Are you going to wear the shirt? I'm like, no, absolutely not. That's like wearing, like, you say you go see a band and they're wearing their own t-shirts as they take stage. That's so dork. Like, if they know who you are, that's why they're there. If they don't know who you are, just enjoy it. Yeah. Like, let them experience something new.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I like playing anonymously, but I did play my Raga Draga deck at a new store one time, and somebody said, "Oh, do you know who Matt Morgan is? Like, he does that." I'm like, yeah, I've heard of him.
I'm familiar with Matt Morgan.
I told them like over the course of the conversation, but it was just kind of funny. Like, do you know who that person is? Like, yeah, that's me.
That's fantastic. So, looking at another one here, like recently you turned your Trostani deck into an Emil deck. So,
yep,
you made that switch over and you're doing more blink stuff. Mm-hmm. So like looking at that deck, there's a couple things that jumped out at me. That was the one I picked. I also knew that was a recent build of yours. Number one, you have a pretty small main board. So when I look at like the Architect thing, you've got like 3 or 4 cards in your main board, your sideboard, which you're kind of using as a cards you might use or things you swapped out, versus looking at any of my decks in Architect where I've got like 40 cards in there. So I'm guessing, we've discussed this, but like pretty clearly you tinker with those kind of things less than I do.
Oh, significantly less. Yeah. When I build a deck, once I get down to that final 99 plus or 98, whatever, I have a pretty good idea of what I want it to do. And so I'll keep track of cards I want to try out, or cards that I have bought but haven't come in the mail yet, whatever it is. That's where my maybe board or my sideboard comes into play on Architect. It's tracking cards that I just need to get. Sure. It is not cards that I'm like thinking about, hypothesizing with. Especially for a deck that is as old as this deck is. So the journey of this deck specifically, even like it has been an evolution, truly has. It started out as my Mirri Weatherlight Duelist deck, which then transformed into my Trostani Discordant deck, which now has turned into my Emil the Blessed deck. It's been kind of just such a process because I realized with my Mirri Weatherlight Duelist deck, I had taken out a lot of the rewards for having cards tapped. Like Glare of Subdual was a card that I really wanted to make good. It doesn't scale as well, especially with just the tools that we had at the time. It's probably super good right now just because there's so much more support for Commander. But 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. So eventually worked its way into Trostani Discordant with a bunch of creatures that had ETB triggers. And so it became a Panharmonicon deck. And then I got another Panharmonicon with Elish Norn, Mother of the Machines. So it really had evolved. And then finally, I just had to have the coming to Jesus moment with myself where, okay, why aren't you just leaning into it and accepting that this deck is completely different from how it was even when you put Trostani at the head of the deck? So I put Emil the Blessed in the command zone. I've gotten to play a couple games with it so far. It finally was a chance for me to allow the commander to catch up with where the deck had gotten to, because the deck has gotten very powerful over the years. I've had the deck for 70 years at this point. So yeah, very powerful deck. I do love it. But yeah, it's been a progression. It's been an evolution for sure.
But it's still a very Matt Morgan deck. Like, you're doing blink stuff, but you're doing blink stuff in a lot of ways because like you want to play creatures.
Yeah.
You're not like trying to find some like convoluted combo to, you know, take people out of the game. You're just like, oh, this is I'm going to play this creature that's going to, you know, Reclamation Sage, for example, destroys an artifact or enchantment. It's a removal spell. Well, it's also a body that I can then use to swing at people with, or I can blink it to get the effect again. Like it's a very Matt Morgan feeling version of a blink deck.
Yeah, and that is true. And I like playing these Army in a Can type of creatures too. Regal Caracal, Tovolar's Huntmaster, kind of those creatures that they're going to come down, they're going to make a bunch more creatures, and then I'm going to reward myself for having all those creatures on the battlefield. I'm still playing Craterhoof. This deck is of that power level. It's punching at that level. I really enjoy doing stuff like that. And then it's really easy to just churn through the deck too, because you have stuff like Woodland Acolyte, Elvish Visionary. And so I pretty much have something to do at any given point in the game, which is another thing I do. I don't like having open mana, but if I do, I want to have like an immediate plan for that mana that I'm, you know, passing the turn with. And so, yeah, it's still very much a me deck. There's a lot of really cool and fun stuff, a lot of combat triggers to take. Yeah.
So one of the things I think of when I see this deck from you, so like my son just read Blood Meridian for a class in high school.
Okay.
Cormac McCarthy novel. And when we were talking about it recently, he made a comment about like, you can tell Cormac McCarthy from like a paragraph, like the way he writes, he has a voice that's very specifically Cormac McCarthy. No matter what he's writing, you can tell what it is.
Yeah.
And there's that, your decks have that version of that for you. This is been created with Matt Morgan's voice, right? It's like your version of someone's writing style that like you can tell it's them. You brew in a way that you can tell is you. You've been playing long enough and doing enough of this that your decks have a very specific flavor. Yeah. And that's something I do run into people if I, you know, play people at my LGS long enough. I can eventually, like, particularly people that run around a long time, I get that sense from them. But not everyone has that, and you definitely have that with your decks, and it makes them really interesting to look at and to play against.
Well, and I take that very much as a compliment too, because one thing that we like to say about, you know, when you're building a deck, how can you tell what is enough of anything? And you like to say all the time on this podcast, it's kind of more art than science, 100%. And so when you're taking that and kind of just taking that thought process a step further, even, okay, well, building a deck is more art than science. You're right, because everybody's going to build differently. Everybody's going to have these different emphasis on what they like to do. And everybody has like those, they're called pet cards for a reason, because you love playing them in so many decks. Legion Loyalty is a card like I wish I would have given a chance more, because I've been loving it every single time that I see it on the battlefield. And so, yeah, just finding those cards that I giving myself permission, I guess, is a good way to put it, where I'm giving myself permission to play this card that's huge and over the top, and I wouldn't normally play it, but like just give it a chance. And so I do like that I've kind of found my home where I can put Growing Rights of Itlimoc in every stinking deck I own, because I know that I'm going to plan around it in a way that I'm always going to have those 4 creatures pretty much at any given point in time.
Yeah, well, like Legion's Loyalty, that's a card too. When it works, it's just fun.
It's so good.
It's one of those things that like just makes you light up with glee when it happens. You get it down and you've got bodies in play that you can like then get the myriad triggers off from, and it's worth having times when you're like, this just isn't fast enough for this particular pod, and I got this card in hand that's dead. That feels bad, but the times you land it and it works feels so good that like
so good.
It's worth taking a few on the chin once in a while when I can't play it, for the times it does work.
Yeah, and that was a lesson. So over the course of us kind of doing this podcast, we've got to network with a bunch of other creators, other Magic players, and Legion Loyalty is 1,000% a Brian Kibler inspired card. Because kind of like how you say, you look at my Emil deck and you know it's a Matt Morgan deck. Kibler is kind of the same way. You look at a Brian Kibler list, you're like, oh, this makes sense. I know exactly who made it. And Legion Loyalty was one of those cards that we were talking about it, and he's like, it just does all the things that I want to do. So in a format that is all about individuality, it's all about self-expression, why not just embrace the cards that are going to let you express that? And I'm like, yeah, 100%, that makes so much sense. And so giving yourself permission to play the cards that you want to play, not the cards you feel motivated to play. Like we do the EDHREC podcast. by nature, it's kind of implied that like, oh, we're trying to help you get better and do the right things. The right thing is always up to you. It's never a
right
100% yes, right or wrong type of thing. Like if you want to play this thing, that's why we're playing Commander, and play what you want to play.
Yeah, that's definitely a journey I think we've all taken, where you start out and you're like focused on, I want to, to a degree, optimize. I want to make this better and better and better. But at some point, you like, the end path from that takes you to a point where the deck is no longer it's no longer your deck, and it's no longer playing the game that you want to play. Or maybe it is. Maybe like you take that all the way to the end and optimize as much as you possibly can, and that's still fun for you.
Yeah.
All of us have hit that point where you're like, this is going a direction where we don't want to go anymore, and we're going to pull it back. Mm-hmm. And you probably can listen to early episodes of the podcast and like see that the different takes we've had and how we built Brewed early on compared to how we do today. It's been, enough years that we've had arcs in terms of ourselves as deck brewers.
Yeah, and just letting yourself kind of grow as a deck builder, whether it's putting yourself into a situation where you're outside your comfort zone, building a specific deck or something like that. Or like I just said, with my big revelation is give yourself permission to play those pet cards, to play the cards that you don't think are maybe the best, especially if they're some big mana payoff, but let yourself experience that, firsthand before you make a decision whether or not you want to keep playing it or not. Because I think just people need to try things more often, because that I've learned more about my own process and what I like to do because I've tried new things. Like I remember when that Collected Company, there was a Malira Murderous Redcap combo deck that was all about, looping the sacrifice outlets, doming the table infinitely or gaining infinite life, whatever it looked like. I struggled so much with that deck. My brain hurt after a 3-round just night of Modern, but I learned so much after the course of like practicing that deck and getting to know it better. By the time I got done and had that deck figured out, I was like, oh, this is actually like exactly what I want to be doing. It's big and over the top, and it's fun. And that's kind of what carried over into Commander is I can do these big over the top, these big fun things, and it still is going to be fine. Like I still can win games if that's really what I'm going for.
And you're winning them in a way that's like your way. You found a way to do it in a way that feels like it's something like true to the way you enjoy playing.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now we are going to take our break here to do some challenging of the stats. When we come back, I want to talk about ways to do this kind of stuff in colors that aren't green, because it's much easier to turn things sideways and swing it at people when you have, access to Craterhoof Behemoth and all the different variants of that than it is in colors that don't have that. And you've got decks that do those things. So let's challenge some stats. When we come back, we'll talk about that. So our listener challenge this week was set to us by listener CJ Whiteloff. The challenge is for the card Cryptic Gateway in Miriam Sentinel Worm decks. Now, Cryptic Gateway is an artifact, 5 mana to cast, and you can tap 2 untapped creatures you control, and you may put a creature card from your hand that shares a creature type with each creature tapped this way onto the battlefield. CJ writes, Miriam will make a copy of the dragon that you put into play with Cryptic Gateway, and then you can repeat the process. Not only does this create you a board full of dragons, but it fuels some of the most common card draw and win cons ran in Miriam decks. And the nice thing about this too is Cryptic Gateway ignores things like Summoning Sickness. So when you cast a dragon and it makes a token copy of that dragon, you can then, before the end of the turn in which, you've left those dragons that you couldn't attack with probably up as blockers, presumably, before your start of your turn, well, you can, at instant speed, tap those 2 dragons, play another dragon with Cryptic Gateway, make the token copy of that, and when it's back to your turn, you now have just a huge board already. 5 mana is a lot, but in a deck where you're, oftentimes playing giant 5 or 6 mana dragons for free because of these creatures that you were playing anyway, it's kind of a perfect deck for Cryptic Gateway. I think it's a card that people forget about because it hasn't seen a lot of reprints, and 5 mana is a lot for an artifact that requires creatures to do something. But yeah, that's a perfect slot for it, and it should be in more Miriam decks. Right now it's in just 700 of the 20,000 on EDHREC. If you're playing Miriam, take a look at Cryptic Gateway.
So for my challenge this week, I have noticed a little bit of a trend with Moira Trash Tactician decks. So Moira is the new in Bloomborough Gruul Commander. At the beginning of your first main phase, you add a red or a green for each raccoon you control. So nice way to generate mana for having a whole bunch of raccoons on the battlefield. And then whenever you expend 4, so you spend 4 mana total on spells, you gain 3 life, and whenever you expend 8, you exile the top 2 cards of your library, and until the end of the next turn, you can play those cards. I think this is a super powerful, fun ability. You get raccoon support for just building decks with a whole bunch of raccoons in which you couldn't really do before Bloomborough came out. But there's something of a non-bo that kind of creeps up a little bit. I want people to be a little mindful of it as they're building their decks. So Moira needs you to spend mana to cast your spells. And so showing up in about 10% each are cards like Herald's Horn, Ruby Medallion, Emerald Medallion. Normally, I think these are fantastic cards, especially the medallions, because they can generate you multiple mana over the course of any given turn by casting a bunch of spells. Well, Moira needs you to spend mana. In order to hit that expend, you have to actually use that mana. And so cost reduction artifacts like this, like Herald's Horn, those aren't actually what you want to be doing. It's kind of a little bit of a non-bo because you're requiring yourself to spend more mana. And so maybe certain thresholds aren't going to be met when you're playing those cards. You still need to be actually spending that mana to cast. And so Ruby Medallion, making everything cost 1 less, means you have to cast all the more spells. And so maybe instead of using exactly 8, you're going to hit 6, and you got to spend maybe 4 more mana. So it just raises the cost of everything. I don't like how that synergizes with Moira very much. I see where people are coming with it because they are extremely powerful cards, able to generate a ton of mana value any given turn, but I don't think that in Moira decks, this is exactly where you want to be. So if you are playing Moira, give a second look to if you actually want Herald's Horn, all these cost reduction artifacts, because they might be making it a little bit harder to hit those expend thresholds than you might think. So just be mindful as you're building those decks.
Yeah, that's a good call. I myself have run into that before too. The thing that I occasionally hit with those is I realize I have a bunch of decks that don't have colorless mana costs, or a bunch of creatures that don't have colorless costs. Mm-hmm. You need to have a threshold of that as well to run those effects. In the right situation, they're amazing. You can find yourself getting caught in a situation where they don't work as well as you want them to.
Yeah, absolutely. So just keep in mind as you're building your decks, what you're putting in there as far as your mana support.
All right. So, Matt, I kind of teased us talking about how to brew green when you're not in green, because that's a thing you, like I mentioned, you've kind of done a little bit. You have a token deck in Izzet colors.
Yep.
So when you're brewing something like that, we'll start with the blue half of that. If you're brewing in blue and you want to, you're still turning stuff sideways, you're playing a combat damage deck, what kind of things are you focused on doing to make that color play the way you want the game to play, even if blue isn't naturally inclined to do those things?
So this deck is actually super funny when I think about it, because when you look at all of the sorceries, they're almost all red. And then when you look at the instants, they're almost all blue. And so it's like super color divided. So the blue is very much that support color, getting me a little bit of protection, a little bit of utility there. And then my red is my big over the top stuff. So it's super funny just like how clearly like delineated that color balance is sorceries are just red, instants are blue. That's just how the deck happened to line out. But I've wanted to build a token deck in Jeskai colors for so long. It was a fun standard deck back when I was playing standard. And so I really wanted this to work super, super bad. It's done pretty well for itself, though. So Ovika was just getting a chance to play cards like Hordling Outburst, and that's not a good card. Like nobody's like jonesing to put Hordling Outburst into a deck.
Right.
But having a home where like Ovika Enigma Goliath, where whenever I cast non-creature spells, I create X/1/1 goblins, where X is the mana value of that. So I'm able to play these huge spells and getting benefit for it. I'm absolutely here for that. I love being able to do stuff like that. And so, yeah, I know Izzet tokens isn't really a typical color combination for that, but again, I have a type, and just because I'm changing the colors of the deck doesn't mean the strategy is going to be something completely foreign to what I like to do.
Yeah, and people tend to think in terms of like overruns with green. I'm going to give all my creatures, +3/+3 and trample to power over people.
Yep.
Red does have some like worse versions of that. A lot of times they are commons that you see mostly as like draft archetype stuff that, if you're playing in a limited environment, but like
That's not always
used
true.
Things like right. Well, I've used things like Ambitious Assault is not a great card from Neon Dynasty, but creatures you control get +2/+0 to end a turn. If you have creatures that are like flying tokens, for example, +2/+0 is, in a token deck that's going wide, is probably enough to kill somebody. It's not as easily used as something like an Overrun, where you're going to be able to trample over if creatures don't have evasion. But if they do have evasion, like, there are things you can do in those colors that aren't maybe splashy and are not on rares, but they will get the job done.
But yeah, like Surge to Victory, I mean, it's not an Overrun, it's not a Beastmaster Ascension.
Yeah.
But it could be better.
Right.
And so this deck is all about like the cards that either they're going to be amazing and I'm never going to look back, or it's going to be like, ugh, that wasn't very good and maybe I should look back. A lot of kind of low floor, but super high ceiling type of cards. And I like having a home for that, just to, if it happens, it happens types of games.
And you do maybe have to be a little bit more careful, like Gravitational Shift in green, in blue.
Yeah.
The creatures with flying get +2/+0. Creatures without flying get -2/-0.
Oh.
Well, if you are playing someone else who's playing a deck with a handful of flyers, that's not the kind of card you want to drop without a plan and like just say, well, hopefully they don't swing at me.
Yeah.
But you don't have to do it that way. You can like get yourself in that position where the person who's playing with other flyers is tapped out, or they don't think you're a threat. Treat it as a sorcery.
Yeah, 100%.
If you play that when you're in a position where you can swing, then it doesn't matter if they have flyers.
That's one thing that I think a lot of players kind of get this thing in the back of their head where, okay, I have this in my hand, so I have to play it as soon as possible. Where the timing of it, Gravitational Shift as a 5-mana sorcery speed combat trick actually can mess things up pretty bad. Like I've been hosed by that card so many times that I've seen it work. And it's kind of like Coat of Arms. It's not something you just want to sit out there because, again, like you pointed out, maybe somebody else is playing a Typal Dex, and so that's going to give them an even better buff than it gives to you. Right. So playing cards at the right time and being patient with them is absolutely critical when you're playing these types of decks. And so, Gravitational Shift, yes, it could backfire. You also don't have to play it on turn 5. You can wait, you can set up and develop your board a little bit more, and then play it when you're going in for the Alpha Strike. That's what this deck likes to do a lot too, is I could play a lot of cards early on. I could kind of blow those, cannons early, whatever you want to say, or just be patient a little bit. And this is probably the deck that has taught me the most about that, is learning when it's my time to strike. And I win a lot with this deck, I feel, because once you do play it right, once you've kind of learned the timing of it, because Ovika's 7 mana, and I'm in Izzet colors, like I'm not getting to 9. That's just how the deck works. And so making sure I play it and then maximize that next turn, that is absolutely one of the biggest lessons I've learned, but it also has taught me a lot that's applied to other decks too.
It forces you to be patient and pick your moments.
Yeah.
And I honestly, like, playing out in the wild, I think the biggest mistake I see from people is being impatient and not picking their moment and just like wanting to do the thing as soon as possible, even when it's not ripe for you to do that. And sometimes you just need to play a deck that like forces you to learn how to pick those moments. And not to say you can't sometimes be aggressive when the moment calls for you to be aggressive as well, but like make that decision and make that choice with intentionality. This is a situation where I'm going to just slow roll this and hang back a little bit versus everyone else is playing slow. I have a perfect chance to go aggressive now.
Well, and I think that's one thing of the three of us on this podcast, you do better than either of us, is you pick your spots. We know that when you go to punch somebody, you're making it the biggest and best timed punch ever. Like, you're not just trying to throw wild things out there and kind of wear yourself out to like play out this boxer analogy. You're picking your spot exactly when you want. You know exactly when to make your move. And it's so hard to react once you have your claws in, once you have that. And we kind of know, like, if you've realized what Dana's doing, it is already too late. You have lost.
Well, and I think, thank you for that. But I think that's also part of that, is because over the years, I've played decks that don't give me a choice but to pick my moment. When you're playing fair. Asperia, that's a 6-drop, and all your Sphinxes are 6-drops. Like, you have to pick your moment because you just don't have a choice. You have to control the game a little bit and wait till the moment's right. Going aggressive isn't an option.
Because you only have 3 Sphinxes anyways, and what's going to happen if they get rid of one?
Absolutely. So yeah, no, but I think sometimes like those are things you have to force yourself to learn because if you're never in a situation to learn that, then you're not going to be able to put it into practice.
Yeah, it's so valuable playing decks and commanders that are a little bit outside your comfort zone, but you're still able to find that common ground in doing something that is familiar to you, because it's not like you're just being handed a deck that is completely foreign and nothing you would ever build otherwise. Having sort of okay, I'm going to learn it this way, but I'm also going to get exposed to this on the same deck. So having those calculated, measured learning moments is absolutely super, super valuable. If you handed me one of your decks, for example, I would be 100% lost because I don't have that connecting point. I don't have that common ground of like, this is something that I do know. So now I can focus on learning that new thing because I don't have to worry about learning a whole new deck, for example, whole new strategy, color combinations I'm not used to, whatever. And yeah, Vika Enigma Goliath, I'm very grateful that I've built this deck because A, it's a lot of fun, but B, also like I've learned a bunch about and just lessons that I think you and Joey do way better than I do. And so having a chance to kind of catch up on that front, it makes our games a lot more enjoyable for me because I'm not just swinging wildly and then it's like, oh, well, you answered my one thing. Well, now I'm just out of luck.
Well, so we talked about red and blue doing that a little bit, and you do have a lot of Selesnya decks, but in a situation where you like are playing white without access to green, what is white's version of being able to turn stuff sideways and kill people? What do they do that makes you feel like you're playing in green?
Yeah, so I guess if blue was leaning into evasion, red is talking about those explosive plays, the big powerful combat tricks, stuff like that. I would say white is so good at anthems. If you have an established board presence, again, it's kind of those sorcery speed combat tricks where you can play some massive anthem. I know that we like to poo-poo on unsets, but Starlight Spectacular is truly a spectacular card. Like, it lives up to its name. That card giving, basically, like, you pump up the team for how many creatures you have on the battlefield. It's a math lesson, but at least it's a math lesson you only have to do once, because if it doesn't win you the game, something went very, very wrong.
That card may have failed as a way to be a less mentally taxing version of Cathar's Crusade, but as a way to win games, it has absolutely succeeded. If you are going wide and white, that's just a fantastic card.
It's so good. And so, yeah, having cards like that, like I know you're a big fan of True Conviction. Cards like that maximize what you have on the battlefield is super, super powerful, super able to lean in. And you can go wide with white decks pretty easily. So it's not that hard to establish a board presence, whether you're making a bunch of tokens, anything like that. And then, okay, well, I'm just going to multiply the power on everything there. So it is fun. It's kind of a little bit like red where, yeah, if you're winning through combat, you're going to make sure that those combat steps that you do go for it matter more than your opponents. And it is nice too, because in white, you do have access to a bunch of lifelink. So you're able to kind of earn more combat steps than your opponents too. And if that's what you're trying to do, having more combat steps than your opponents, that's how you win, because they just can't keep up with you racing, gaining all that life back, and then having more combat steps.
Well, I just got blown out pretty badly against a bird deck that was running a lot of tokens, running a lot of smaller birds. So it was pretty evasive, number one, but like it's going wide, number two. But I was sure I was like, oh, okay, well, I will take these, 4 hits from these tokens. I'm going to block these 3 because I had some flyers out. And then Dictative Heliod came down because it has flash. Those creatures +2/+2.
Yeah.
And so I went from, thinking I'm going to take like 6 to the face to taking like, 12 to the face. And the 3 creatures that I thought were going to survive combat all died, and that person's attacker survived. So like you can do some combat tricks with stuff in white as well.
I feel like Dictative Heliod is like that 1996 Nissan Maxima my mom used to have. It's not glamorous and everybody's kind of moved on from it, but it gets the job done. It gets you there.
Yeah.
And it's...
the flash on that really makes a difference.
The flash makes a world of difference because it is a combat trick. It effectively is a combat trick that sticks around. I love Dictative Heliod. People kind of forget about it. And I think that's one thing that a lot of players kind of shy away from with white is, well, I don't like the ways that it does it because it's not flashy. It's not a glamorous type of way to win.
It's very workmanlike would be the word I would use.
Blue collar, even though it's white. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it.
So how about black? I think black's the trickiest one, at least for me. Is there anything when you're doing this in black that you have ways to take people out?
Does black win through combat? I don't think it does.
So you can, I've killed people with more than a few tainted strikes over the years. And there's a few, howl from beyond kind of effects, but it's blacks, you get what you see. It's there on the board. Yeah. And there's not a lot of ways necessarily to change that math for the most part.
I think the way that I would be winning through black, if I were playing a dominantly black deck at least, because black is a tertiary color in the decks that I do play it in. So this is the one that I've been struggling the most with, because even when I played black in my Alila deck, for example, that was when I was playing a lot of fairies and able to crank out a decent army. Black wasn't the marquee color at all, but it was able to provide a lot of support. And so for me, and listeners, I'm sure are going to tell me, well, these cards are great, but you're right, Dana. Tainted Strike that's a good way to win because you're going all in with one certain creature. But man, I feel like black on its own in an aggro strategy kind of struggles a little bit, and maybe that's why I don't play a ton of black. Yeah. You can play it as a support color, like Rakdos. Those decks can be very fast, but I feel like black isn't lending itself to the combat so much as it's punishing people for answering what you're doing with the red side of the deck. So you have those Zulaport Cutthroat effects. You have all of the board wipes, all the resurrection effects, stuff like that to supplement the creatures. Because black definitely wants creatures on the battlefield if you're playing aristocrats type of strategies. And maybe this is a question that we can ask Joey.
Sure. How
do you actually win with combat? I don't know how to win with combat. And I'm sure there's ways you can deal like double damage. There's grievous wounds, those types of things. That's a card that I'm sure is going to do a lot of work. And yeah, I think that's probably what I would encourage folks to do.
Yeah, I kind of struggle with that a little bit as well. I think the answer, when I usually see it done well, it's just because they are throwing disposable bodies at you in the terms of recursive creatures or zombie tokens that you're just going to keep making and maybe have other zombies that buff them up. So the anthems are on creatures versus standalone. But that tends to be what it is. It's all, like I said, it's all right there on the field versus you surprising people with something.
It feels like most of those zombie decks that are playing just black, it's some kind of Rube Goldberg machine where this thing happens, then this thing happens, which makes that. And then there's a chain reaction of things. And that's how you get an overwhelming thing. It's not a straightforward type of approach like I would be taking with a green deck, for example. And so, yes, I'm sure overwhelming folks probably is how you would get there, I would say. And then punishing people for blocking. That is one thing that I have found a good home for black in an accessory color is, okay, I'm going to do this thing. Are you going to block my creatures? Because if you do, you're still taking all that damage because of the death triggers, because of whatever else it happens to be.
Yeah, and aesthetically, maybe it matches black's kind of vibe as well, where you can make one thing very, very powerful, like Hatred, the Tainted Strike that we mentioned, whatever, but black isn't maybe a team player. It isn't good at making everyone powerful. It's good at making one thing powerful.
But that's just how black's approach just in the color pie is I don't need you. I'm going to do everything by myself. Yeah. So yeah, black, I think that's a really, really good way to put it is black's not a team player. It doesn't like to do things along with other colors. Wants to stand on its own. So I get that.
I'd be interested. This is a good one. I'm looking to hear maybe some feedback from listeners about what they do if they want to try to play a black deck that way, because it does feel like it's the color that's most limited in terms of if you want to just turn stuff sideways, what options you have to win those games and put things away.
Well, and it's funny too, because even in your black predominant decks, your what was it, the Dragon Lord that you had, the blue-black one, Silumgar, yeah. It wasn't that, you were just beating down with one creature. You're keeping the board clear and making sure nobody ever had any blockers. But also, eventually, 7 drops are going to get there. Right, once you start casting a 7 drop every turn, that's kind of my Vivictus Asmati deck is, okay, once we get to turn 10, you're hosed because I'm just casting 8 drops and I'm spending more mana than you every turn. Yeah. And so it is kind of wild just to see, eventually you'll get there, I guess, if you're playing big enough creatures.
Yeah, and you're playing, in that case, that deck, you're playing black-blue, so you have some control elements. Pretty easy to, keep the game going at the pace you want until you can get to that point.
Yeah.
So, for sure. Well, listeners, I'm looking forward to hearing any feedback from you have about how you can make other colors do the things that Matt likes to do in the game. because I kind of like doing the same stuff in a lot of ways too, or at least my version of it. So I think most people, particularly like newer players, like turning stuff sideways and like getting in the red zone that way as well.
It is like the primordial way of learning how to win a game of Magic. It's just a person has 20 life or 40 life in Commander. How do you get it down to 0? And combat is the first way we learn how to do it. Like when you play Arena tells you, okay, you attack this person and you get them to 0 life. And so maybe that's just stuck with me. Like I remember a good analogy for this is I played Undertale and I accidentally got the happy ending because at the beginning of the game, they tell you, oh, you don't have to attack people. You can just charm them and do whatever you need to do. And you don't have to be violent. And so like, okay, well, Goat Mom told me not to be violent. And so I just did that the entire time. Well, Arena told me, okay, we'll just attack people and get them to 0. And so that's what I've just been doing the whole time. And granted, they're telling me the same thing, just opposite directions. One is don't be violent. One is be violent. Just tell me, make an early impression is what I'm saying, if that's how you want to influence me.
Exactly. All right. Well, Matt, hey, where can people find you if they want to look you up on the interwebs and tell you their thoughts on how to win in the red zone here with creature damage?
Yeah, well, if you want to tell me how to play aggressive decks in black, you can do so on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And you can show me some very cool creature decks in your Ultimate Guard stuff, any of your deck boxes, your sleeves. We're proud members of Team Ultimate Guard, so check them out for just all the best deck accessories.
And you can find me online at Dana Roach. I'm writing articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast. And although he's not here, Joey Schultz is here in spirit as he's editing this episode.
In spirit.
You can find him online at Joseph M. Schultz. He's all over the Instagrams. Thank you very much for listening. And until next week, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.